In the year 2000, my favorite thing in the world was waking up on Saturday mornings to a big-ass bowl of Fruity Pebbles and play Pokemon Red while simultaneously watching Kids WB. This programming block had all the cool shows like X-Men Evolution, Jackie Chan Adventures, Hysteria, Card Captors, Pokemon, and so much more. But one of my favorites was a little show called Static Shock. It was about this teenager named Virgil Hawkins that had electromagnetic powers. He was smart, witty, and had a really cool costume. For me, that's all that really mattered, and at the time, I didn't really think twice about how my black friends got an extra layer of enjoyment from seeing a hero that looked like them as the main character. Regardless, there was no denying that Static Shock left a huge impact on a lot of people. But whatever happened to it, and why is it that now when superheroes are more popular than ever, Static has been shoved to the backside? The answer is actually really interesting and involves a lawsuit. But in order for that to make sense, you need to first understand the history of a little company called Milestone Comics. Oh yeah, Static is not a DC Comics character. So what's the deal? And if they don't own him, then how did Static make his way into so much DC stuff? Well, it's a good thing you're watching a guy that does more than read Wikipedia. I actually read the comics and got my hands on this rare history book all about the company. Let me fill you in. Back in the 90s, comic books were insanely popular and new companies were popping up left and right to capitalize on the craze. Most of these new publishers failed, but Milestone was special. See, Marvel and DC had obviously tried their hands at making diverse superheroes in the past, but it was clear that they were having a hard time getting them to achieve any kind of long-lasting success. Frustrated with this lack of diversity in comics, a team of talented veterans of the industry came together to address the issue. Using the connections they had already established within the industry, the founders of Milestone were able to enter an extremely unique arrangement with DC Comics. DC would publish Milestone's books, and as a part of that, Milestone retained all of the rights to their work and would have the final say on all merchandising and licensing deals regarding their properties. DC would also promote Milestone within the pages of their own comics and at conventions, get them preferred placement in comic book shops, made them available at convenience and grocery stores, and on top of that, they would pay Milestone between $500,000 and $650,000 a year to license their characters. The only thing that DC would take in exchange for this was a share of the profits and the sole condition that they had the option to not publish anything that they were uncomfortable with. All in all, that's a pretty sweet deal. Milestone got a lot of hype and press before the release of their first books, and when they finally hit the scene, it was a huge deal. The first 4 titles were Hardware, Icon, Blood Syndicate, and Static, and that would set the stage for Milestone's legacy, making them the most prominent minority-owned comic company that the industry had ever seen before or since. While all of the books did well, Static was the breakout character. Because Milestone could more or less write whatever they want, their titles covered some extremely heavy subject matter that other mainstream comics shied away from. But while this was by no means an exception for the Static comic, handling topics like racism, homophobia, gun violence, police brutality, anti-Semitism, and teenage sexuality, Static was by far the most fun-loving and humorous comic that Milestone had to offer. He was like Spider-Man in a lot of ways, a teenage superhero in a world of adults who constantly cracked jokes and was clearly intelligent. Although Virgil had a lot of powers at his disposal, most times he would have to stop the bad guy with a clever solution, as opposed to just brute force. That being said, Static did have some controversy and resulted in one of the few times where DC decided to step in and not publish a Milestone comic. So the cover of Static number 25 featured Virgil and his girlfriend Daisy about to have sex, roll of condoms in hand, and sex manual on the floor. This made the higher-ups at DC very uncomfortable, and they banned it from publication. Milestone's editor-in-chief, Dwayne McDuffie, offered to have the condoms airbrushed off the cover, but DC still would not budge on their decision. As a compromise, the image had a large heart border around it, but the full cover was printed inside of the comic, along with a scathing note about it from McDuffie. Although Milestone made a huge splash in the comic industry, they were never a huge success, or even really a failure. Although their characters come from multiple ethnic backgrounds, Milestone was never able to shake the stigma that they were just black comics for black people. As a result, comic shops with a mostly white customer base didn't order these comics as much because they didn't want to end up with piles of unsold books. Unable to justify the cost of publishing comics, Milestone closed their doors in 1997, but as we all know, that wouldn't be the end of Static. Dwayne McDuffie stayed at DC and worked in animation, helping bring Virgil to the small screen. In order to help paint a better picture of the cartoon series, let me hand things over to my friend Maddie with the Watchtower Database. They're a channel that's dedicated to talking about DC's animated work. So take it away, Maddie.
Going as far back as Milestone's beginnings in 1993, there had been attempts by DC editor-in-chief Jenette Kahn to pitch their characters for animated television. Almost immediately, Batman the Animated Series producer Alan Burnett was roped into the process, and while it would take years before a project was greenlit, that didn't dissuade anyone from continued attempts. These pitches ranged from an X-Men-like series in which characters from the Dakotaverse would be grouped up on a team called the New Guard, an Icon movie, a live-action version of Static starring Jonathan Taylor Thomas for some reason, and another pretty yikesy premise where Virgil would have been adopted by a white family. The executives knew they struck gold when, in the middle of an Icon pitch, Alan Burnett switched gears to Static and described him as Chris Rock at 14 with powers. Almost immediately, Kids WB brought in Static Comics artist Dennis Cohen to go deeper into detail on the premise of who the character was and what the show would be. Alan suggested that Static's other creator, Dwayne McDuffie, be brought on to write a few episodes. At first, this was seen as a risky move since Dwayne had never written for television before. But after turning in his first script, which only took him 1 day to write, everyone was so impressed that, according to Burnett, it informed the entire direction of the show going forward. As Drake alluded to earlier, the team behind Static, the comic, was never afraid to tackle heavy topics in their writing. But now that the character was coming to the small screen, there were some things that had to be changed for younger audiences. Those changes came in the form of reimagined versions of the characters, like axing Frida's battles with bulimia, or changing Virgil's gay friend Rick Stone to implied to be gay but never confirmed on screen Richie Foley, as well as toning down the violence or removing subplots about the city of Dakota's political landscape. Even with those changes, Static Shock still did a brilliant job capturing the soul of the source material, and delivered not only a kids' action superhero show for 4 years, but a show that was able to give the viewers a look into heavy topics like gun violence, racism, and even dyslexia. And then it's back over to Drake.
After 4 seasons, the show was canceled not because it was bad or unpopular. Far from it. Static Shock's ratings were really strong, the show was nominated for a bunch of awards, and it even won some. But like many animated shows, every episode of Static Shock was made at a loss, and it was expected to make up the difference with toys and other merchandise. But that's the issue. For some reason, the show had a hard time attracting licensors. There were no toys, no t-shirts, and no posters. I mean, Subway got some kids meal swag, but that was it. Subway. Freaking Subway. Like, I didn't even know that they did kids meals. That's... wow. There was a 4-issue miniseries that was released to try and capitalize on the TV show's popularity, but this was also at a period of time where comic sales were starting to massively plummet across the entire industry, which it still hasn't fully recovered from. Now, even without that extra revenue stream, Warner Brothers still continued to make the Static Shock series, even though it was losing them money. But they called it quits after 52 episodes, since that would be enough for the show to last in syndication, allowing there to be a new episode every week. So, was that it for Static? No. Milestone had a few attempts at making it back in the spotlight, most significantly in 2008, when their characters were officially folded into the DC Comics continuity. Yeah, despite what the TV show depicts, Milestone's characters had always existed in their own universe separate from DC, outside of the occasional crossover. The official merging of the world allowed for Static to become a member of the Teen Titans, which honestly is just perfect, and DC did plan for him to get his own comic series, but that was unfortunately cancelled after the tragic passing of Dwayne McDuffie. When DC rebooted their comic book universe in 2011, this was the perfect opportunity for the shelved Static series to get made, albeit with a short-lived run that was rife with behind-the-scenes drama between the writer, artist, and editor that ended with the finished product being pretty lackluster. When the series bombed, Static seemed to vanish from DC Comics altogether, and it looks like after some recent comic book shenanigans, he was erased from it entirely. Yet, although he was absent from the comics, Static would make the occasional appearance in other DC media, notably his time in the Young Justice cartoon series and as a playable character in the mobile version of Injustice. Interestingly, Static was supposed to be a playable character in Injustice 2, but was cut, despite being pretty far along in development. So why did this happen? Well, the most likely answer is also why Static and the rest of Milestone's characters have vanished from all of DC media. Lawsuits. Yeah, DC had been saying for years that Milestone was going to be making a comeback, but every time they announced that it was happening, it would then be followed by silence. It turns out that when the Milestone founders got back together to work on this deal with DC, the widow of Dwayne McDuffie, Charlotte Fullerton, was excluded, even though she owned her late husband's 50% of the company's rights, and that instead of buying her out, the other Milestone founders just formed a new company that they called Milestone 2.0, and they proceeded to work with DC without the consent or compensation to the McDuffie estate. Admittedly, it's a lot of legalese that I don't understand, but if that's true, then that's some pretty sleazy stuff. But in 2019, the lawsuit was settled, and I'm happy to confirm that Milestone is finally back. At the time of this recording, the new comics are going to be releasing in just a few days, and as a fan of the character, I am extremely excited for them. I am also really hyped for the supposed live-action Static movie that's in the works, and it does seem like Static is set to make a grand multimedia return and become more popular than ever before. Until then, there are still plenty of awesome comics to read and an amazing show to watch, complete with that killer theme song. I originally wanted this video to be a complete history of Milestone Comics because after doing an insane amount of research, there is so much interesting stuff to talk about. So if you want me to eventually make that, then please make sure to subscribe and sound off in the comments so I know that there is at least some demand. I also want to give a big thank you to Maddie for helping out with this video, so please be sure to check out his channel Watchtower Database for more DC animated goodness. But anyway, I hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.